What's going on, everybody? This is Andre here with the Kevin Breeze channel, and this is pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A02. Let's get right to it. So my first pro for the phone is the display. This phone has a 6.5-inch PLS IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and a screen-to-body ratio of 81.9%. This is definitely one of the larger displays out here. Compared to its predecessor, the Samsung Galaxy A01, that phone looks tiny next to it. In fact, let me grab that real quick. I want you guys to actually see how much of an improvement they made. So this is the Samsung Galaxy A01. Doesn't look too bad. But then this is the Samsung Galaxy A02. You can probably see here, there's such a big difference. The Samsung Galaxy A02 looks huge in comparison to the A01. So they definitely have made an improvement as far as that goes. And not only that, but I know this display is only 720p and technically it's not the greatest out there, but it really looks nice. The colors are really good for what it is, and I really don't have any complaints. The animations, everything is really smooth, which is kind of surprising considering the level and the processor, which we'll talk about later. But overall, if you're doing content consumption, reading, any of that kind of thing where you really have to see things on the screen, this display is going to be really useful for that. Now, of course, if it comes down to something like photo and video editing, which I will be explaining later why that's probably not going to work out on this phone anyway. But let's just say you're trying to do something like that where you really need to pay attention to the meticulous details and colors and that kind of stuff, then having a resolution of 720p might not be the best. But for the purposes of content consumption and that sort of thing, this is a really nice display. Now, my next con for this phone is the camera. Now, the camera itself, I can't say that that's bad. The quality is really not horrible, but this camera is so featureless. This camera doesn't even have portrait mode, which I expect on pretty much any phone these days. Even a $50 track phone you can get at a grocery store usually will have some sort of portrait mode. It might not even be that good, but it's still portrait mode. This phone doesn't even have anything for portrait mode, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because the Samsung Galaxy A01 did have portrait mode, and it was pretty decent too. And then they took it off and put a macro camera on instead. Now, a macro camera is cool and all, but having a basic feature like portrait mode seems like it would be a better priority than having something like a macro camera that not everybody uses. It really only has one use, whereas with portrait mode, I feel like that has a lot more practical application. So that in itself is a pretty big disappointment. And overall, the camera is just pretty featureless and leaves a lot to be desired. Now, my next pro for this phone is the storage. Now, there are two variants of this phone. The first one is 32 gigabytes of internal storage with 2 gigabytes of RAM in the processor. And the second one is 64 gigabytes of storage with 3 gigabytes in the processor. And both, of course, have micro SD card expansion. It is a Samsung, that's pretty expected. For the purposes of this video, this specific phone in my hand is the 64 gigabyte variant. But either way, for the level of this phone, it's a pretty good amount of storage. To put this into perspective, the Samsung Galaxy A01, the predecessor, had 16 gigabytes of internal storage, which in my opinion, that's barely even usable. The system is getting bigger and bigger, and although for these lower end phones, it's not quite as big as something like a Samsung Galaxy A32 5G or something like that, it's still a sizable amount of space that's being taken up that you really have no choice about. And then throw in some apps that you use on a daily basis like Snapchat, Instagram, whatever browser you like to use, Facebook Messenger, all that stuff. That's another 5 gigabytes, something like that. And by the time you actually get through all that on 16 gigabytes, you're gonna have nothing left. Whereas with this phone, you're likely not even gonna have to touch a micro SD card unless you have some serious photos and videos, a ton of those things. Lots of large apps taking up the space on the phone itself. But if you're just using your phone for normal activities, even the 32 gigabyte variant of this phone is gonna be pretty good for you. So I was pleasantly surprised, especially since before I got this phone and really looked into its specs, I was just saying the other day that most phones around this level don't have more than 32 gigabytes. In fact, some of them even have as little as 16. Then I find this phone with double that space, so I think that that is a really nice improvement, especially compared to its predecessor. Again, with 16 gigabytes, this phone is literally quadruple that. So you're gonna get so much more space. I feel like they did go wrong in certain areas of this phone pretty badly, but storage is definitely not one of those areas. And speaking of big downsides to this phone, that brings me to my next con, which is the processor. This phone with the upper variant is getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek MT6739W processor. We ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on the phone, and it came back with a single core score of 106 and a multi-core score of 350. Now, these are really low scores. Hardly anything besides your basic phone activities with this phone at this rate. Web browsing and content consumption should be relatively okay, but anything more than that, if you're trying to play a game, even the simplest games are probably going to have a bit of trouble on here. If you're trying to do photo editing, I'm not really sure how photo editing would work on this. I don't think it takes up that much processing power, so that might be okay. But video editing, you're definitely going to have some trouble again. And anything else, whatever app you're trying to run, is probably going to struggle a little bit. If you're browsing the web and you go on a site that has a lot of things to load, this is going to take longer. If you're on social media, same thing. This kind of score is definitely not what you would want to see if you're looking for anything that has a decent level of performance. There are lots of phones, even a tiny step up from this, that are definitely a lot stronger processor-wise than this one. So for all of its other features, its really nice appearance, large display, everything else, I was definitely disappointed when I saw this. I was a little surprised too, especially considering the predecessor, the Samsung Galaxy A01, is actually a bit faster than this. In fact, quite a bit faster if you really put it into that perspective. So I'm not sure why they made this change, but they did, and it's definitely not one that I am happy about. On the other hand, my next pro for this phone is the battery. This phone has a huge battery with 5,000 milliamp hours. You're not going to be running out of life anytime soon. Not only does it get a lot of life per charge, but you also are going to get that longevity as the battery is degrading. It's not really going to mess up your day that much. Whereas with a smaller battery like an iPhone battery, those batteries degrade really fast and they don't last very long. If you want it to, this phone can definitely last a long time. Now my next con for this phone is the security features. This phone doesn't have face unlock and it doesn't have a fingerprint scanner either, which is a huge disappointment to me. In fact, in my opinion, that is more of a deal breaker. I don't like having to put up with typing in a PIN. So for me, a phone has to have either face unlock or a fingerprint scanner. That's not really a negotiable. So seeing this phone doesn't have anything, you actually have to go type a PIN like it's 2008. It's really disappointing, especially comparing it to the A01 again. The A01 did have face unlock, and that was really nice because even though there was no fingerprint scanner, face unlock is almost as convenient. And the reason that this is such a disappointment is that I've seen lots of phones in this price range that have fingerprint scanners or face unlock, or sometimes even both, and they perform just as well. So with such similar specs, I really don't think the inconvenience of having to type in a PIN at all times on this phone is really even worth it. Now my next pro for this phone is that it has a headphone jack. The headphone jack is actually right here, right next to the microphone, the micro SD port, which we're gonna get to that in a second, and the speaker right here. The reason that this is actually a pro for this phone, the reason that actually matters, is that more and more manufacturers are doing away with headphone jacks, including Samsung itself. The Samsung Galaxy Note series, the S series, all those higher end phones don't have headphone jacks anymore. And that's gonna be pretty much the same across the board, no matter what manufacturer you go to. The headphone jacks are disappearing. And I understand that wireless speakers and headphones and all that are really getting popular, but it's nice to actually be able to use a good old-fashioned pair of headphones when you want to. So having a headphone jack is pretty nice, I think. Now my next con for this phone is that it uses micro USB. My question is why? The vast majority of phones that aren't weird like iPhones using a lightning cable use USB-C. USB-C is a lot better in my opinion, and since they're so common now, it's just easier. If you're upgrading from one Android phone to this phone, then you're most likely already going to have a USB-C because most Android phones use USB-C. So having to get another cable that might not be as good is kind of annoying, and I don't like that about this phone, especially since micro USB doesn't seem like it's any better than USB-C. It's just more of a hassle. Now, my final pro for this phone is the overall design. Despite this phone's many faults, it does look really nice. Not only does it have that huge display, but the screen to body ratio is really good. So these bezels are super thin. Even the part at the bottom that makes the screen to body ratio a little bit lower than you might expect doesn't look too obnoxious. I typically don't like this part of a bezel at all. I think having any thick parts of the bezel is just not good. But this part right here, it doesn't look too bad, and neither does this part. And even though I really don't like water drop notches, this one does look pretty decent. So I don't really mind it a whole lot. Overall, I do like this back here. It's really unique looking, and I think it's pretty nice. And the phone has a sleek, modern look regardless. So overall, I do think the design is really nice, and it's something about this phone that I do really like. Now, my final con for the phone is it's relatively featureless. I was just making a tips, tricks, and hidden features video about this phone, and a lot of the features and different tricks that most Samsung phones typically have are not here on this phone. For example, dual messenger, the feature that allows you to download a copy of an app so you can log into two at once, say Snapchat, Facebook, that kind of thing. That's been on almost every Android phone I've ever seen, but this phone doesn't have it, which is kind of unfortunate. There are other things too, like the gestures, those types of shortcuts. You can't change the navigation bar. You're stuck with the 3-button system, which isn't bad, but I do like a lot of these other phones where you can actually have a choice between gesture navigation and button navigation. So overall, there are a lot of features that I think should have been there that I was really expecting to be there that aren't there, and that was a little bit of a disappointment as well. But this is pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A02. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and hopefully this helped you a little in your decision. If you want to learn more about the phone itself, be sure to watch the full review of the phone on the channel. And to get more info about the pricing and availability, that stuff is always changing, so be sure to check the link in the description. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.